Alright, so let's do another example now. So, as before, first question, what is the longest chain? And so we can see that chain goes here. How many carbons overall? We should get 10 carbons. So our parent chain here is decane. Now, which way do we number this? As before, we've got two choices. So using this direction, these pink numbers, the first substituent we can see is on carbon 4. Now, where is the second substituent? So very commonly students will say 6. And it turns out that's not correct here. Why not? Well, if we go back here to carbon 4, we have a 1 carbon substituent here. But we have a second 1 carbon substituent. So those are two different substituents, and so they count separately. So our first substituent is at 4, our second substituent is at 4. Our third substituent is up here at 7. I'm sorry, our fourth substituent is at 7, because we already got the third one at 6. Now we can also go the other direction. And with these blue numbers, the first substituent is on carbon 4, the second substituent is on carbon 5, and then we have the two substituents on carbon 7. So our first substituent on each chain, each direction, is at carbon 4. So since that's the same, now we go to the second carbon in each chain, in each direction. Now the second carbon has the second substituent has a difference. For the pink numbers, the second substituent is at carbon 4 versus the other direction where the second substituent is at 5. That means that these pink numbers here, that direction gets priority. And when we number this chain, we will start in this direction. All right, so each of our 4 substituents in this molecule are actually only 1 carbon. So we have a total of 4 methyl groups. The prefix for methyl is tetra. So this just becomes 4, 4, 6, 7 tetramethyl decane. All right, now everything we've dealt with so far, which I know is just 2 examples so far, but our substituents have been very simple. What happens if our substituents get more complicated? How do we handle a situation like that? So what about this substituent here? We can see in this molecule that our parent chain is going here. So our parent chain here is 10 carbons, which would make this decane. And in order to get the lowest possible number for that one and only substituent, we would number in this direction. But what would we call this? So first off, we can't call it pentyl. And the reason we can't call it pentyl is pentyl would imply a 5-carbon straight chain where the substituent is connected at the end. So just to go see what that would look like for a second, if we had a pentyl substituent, it would look like that. And so we can't call this one pentyl because clearly those are not the same group. But if we called it pentyl, we would be implying that they were the same group. So what we have to do for a complex substituent like this is we treat the substituent as if it's its own molecule. So if we call the carbon where the substituent attaches to the parent as the first carbon of the substituent, what becomes the longest chain? Well, in either direction, we could have a 3-carbon chain. So that would be propyl. How long is our substituent coming off the propyl? Or to put it very poorly, how long is the substituent within the substituent? Well, our substituent within our substituent is 2 carbons. They're connected at the first carbon in the substituent, so this becomes 1-ethyl propyl. So just to sort of go back over what we did here, we went to the substituent, which is this whole group. We named the first carbon of the substituent, or numbered the first carbon of the substituent as the carbon that is attached to the parent chain. We then found that we had a 3-carbon chain within as the longest chain within the substituent. That's what gave us propyl. And then we had a 2-carbon chain that was attached to the first carbon of the substituent. So we got 1-ethyl propyl. So now finally, to finish our name, this substituent, the 1-ethyl propyl group, is on the 5th carbon of the decane parent. So this becomes 5. And because this is a complex substituent, we put this whole substituent in parentheses. So 5, 1-ethyl propyl decane. And by doing that, we could, in theory, build a name of a substituent of increasingly greater complexity with, further and further branches. Now, we're not going to get to that point, but you can probably start to see how we would do that. Now, the reason that we get into these more complex substituents is that there are some that are very common and very important. And so if we assume in each of these structures that I'm drawing that the R group is the parent chain, then we can just see what's left of the substituent. All right, so the first one is a 3-carbon substituent connected at the middle carbon. So the longest chain here coming from the parent chain is 2 carbons. So that would be ethyl. And at the first carbon of the ethyl, we have a 1-carbon substituent, or a methyl. So this would be known as 1-methyl ethyl. But 1-methylethyl is such a common substituent that it's known more commonly as isopropyl. So if you were taking a quiz or a test or an exam, which one of these is the correct answer? 1-methylethyl or isopropyl? Well, the reality is that both of them are correct. So you could use either one. For the next compound, or the next substituent, and for the ones after this, we can see that these are all 4-carbon substituents. 4-carbon chain, or 4 carbons within the substituent. So that tells us these are going to be, in some way related to butyl groups. Now, if we look at this first one, our longest chain is 3 carbons, which means we have propyl. And on the second carbon, we have a methyl group. So this is 2-methylpropyl. Or it can be known by its common name, which is isobutyl. Our third one is very similar, except the methyl group is attached to the first carbon of the propyl, not the second carbon. So this is 1-methylpropyl. And that is commonly known as sec-butyl. Sometimes I think this is one of the easier ones to remember because sec-butyl, it's on the second carbon of the butyl group. And finally, our fourth one of these is 1,1-dimethyl ethyl, because there are 2 methyl groups attached to the first carbon of the ethyl group. This one is more commonly known as tert-butyl. Now, one slightly annoying piece, and this happens unfortunately way too often with things like this, so I want to look at a little bit of nomenclature. And this is not meant to confuse you. In fact, this is actually the way I remember these. Let's bring those amino acids up again. And I want to draw your attention to 2 of these in particular. I want to look at leucine and isoleucine. So what are the R groups on leucine and isoleucine? And what do I mean by that? So, for example, if you look at alanine, the R group is a methyl group. Remember that an amino acid is a carbon with a hydrogen, a carboxylic acid, a primary amine, and an R group. So for example, in alanine, we have a methyl group. Over here in valine, you can see we have an isopropyl group. So why do I bring up leucine and isoleucine? Well, leucine, we have an isobutyl group, and isoleucine has a sec-butyl group. So, to me, just always a slightly annoying piece of nomenclature that we find with amino acids. But it turns out that's actually the way I remember those, is that isoleucine has the sec-butyl group and leucine has the isobutyl group. Do you need to memorize all of your amino acids? Well, not in this class, but many of you are probably going to be taking biochemistry in the future. And typically in biochemistry classes, yes, you will have to memorize your amino acids. But the other thing I want to say about these other substituents is how do they get alphabetized? So remember that we ignore numerical prefixes for alphabetizing. So sec is a numerical prefix. So sec-butyl gets alphabetized under B. For tert-butyl, the tert is tertiary. That's also a numerical prefix. So tert-butyl also gets alphabetized under B. But iso is not numerical. And so isopropyl and isobutyl get alphabetized under I. All right, so the last piece of this nomenclature that I want to get into are halogens. What do we do with halogens? So when it comes to halogens, they end up being pretty straightforward. So if you have a bromine, for example, you follow all the same rules that you would with an alkyl substituent in terms of numbering it as well as alphabetizing it. But to name it, you call it bromo. Chlorine becomes chloro. And I'm sure you've guessed at this point that iodine becomes iodo and fluorine becomes fluoro. So at this point, we would go and do some practice on nomenclature. But if I do that here, it means I'm going to then have another video to finish this chapter, which will be about 3 minutes long, and I typically like to avoid that. So I'm going to finish out this chapter here by talking about reactions of alkanes. So alkanes are pretty simple. They don't do a whole lot. In fact, we can really say that there's only two important reactions of alkanes. One of them we've already talked about a little bit, which is combustion. And so any alkane, whether it's something very small and simple like methane, can be burned to form carbon dioxide and water. And that's it for combustion. The other reaction that we sometimes see with alkanes is halogenation. And we'll get more into this reaction actually at the very end of Organic 2. At the very end of Organic 2, we'll talk about radical reactions, and that's what this is an example of. But in a halogenation reaction for an alkane, you take the alkane, such as methane, and the halogen, such as Cl2. You could also do this with bromine. And you expose them to ultraviolet light. And as a result, one of your hydrogens gets replaced by a chlorine to give you chloromethane. However, sometimes with this reaction, control can be a pretty significant issue. And this can actually react a second time or a third time, or under the most extreme conditions can react all the way until you don't have any hydrogens left. So sometimes a very helpful reaction, sometimes not so helpful. But that's really it for reactions of alkanes. So at this point, you should go to in-class exercise number 7, which is going to give you a bunch of practice on alkane nomenclature. And then in the next video, I will go over the solutions to those problems.